Hello everyone. I'm Candace Hull and I'm an art teacher here at CHS, and on behalf of the Chatham Education Association, welcome to an evening presentation featuring Dr. Michael Bradley. This presentation is the result of an NJEA FAST grant with the explicit intent of providing content that helps Chatham's families and educators form stronger alliances together. You know that feeling when you're leaving the hospital with your bundle of joy and no instructional manual? This is repeated when your child enters adolescence. So I feel the hospital should give you Dr. Bradley's books wrapped up in a package and say, open in about 13 years. We've had over 125 responses and excellent questions that have been pre-sorted and selected for tonight's presentation. Each registered participant will receive a copy of Crazy Stressed. Please expect the copies to be sent to your child's school for distribution the latter part of next week. I do have 200 copies, so if you would like to receive one and did not pre-register, please email me via CHS. Underneath the video, you're going to see a link to access materials that Dr. Bradley has provided for you to refer to tonight. So grab a pen and paper because you're going to want to take notes. Welcome, Dr. Bradley.
Thank you.
Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Bradley. He grew up in Philadelphia, where he says he barely survived his own adolescence.
That's true.
I think we all can attest to adolescence being difficult. Like so many teens, his path to his passion found many detours. He was an officer in the U.S. Army, a disc jockey, a law school student, before fate landed him in a job working with teenagers, a job he never dreamed he'd love. I can relate to that, being a high school teacher, so yes. That experience caused him to switch his studies to psychology, eventually earning his doctorate from Temple University. In the 30 years since Dr. Bradley has worked with all kinds of teens in all kinds of places, including schools, prisons, and community programs. In addition to being a licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Bradley holds specialized certifications in the treatment of substance abuse and trauma disorders, and is a diplomat and fellow of the American Board of Forensic Examiners. He's had many publications, which if you Google him on Amazon, you will see. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Bradley. Get ready, guys. He's awesome.
Uh-oh. Now the pressure's on. Thank you, Candy. Thank you. I am Dr. Bradley, and I'm here tonight to chat with you guys a little bit about what is going on with our teenagers and to hopefully give you some tips on how to help them get through these incredibly traumatic times. And I do not use that word lightly. As you'll see, they've been struggling pretty much over the past decade in severe ways. And the pandemic has sort of just thrown gasoline on those fires. And let me back up a little bit and kind of explain the basis, the context of this stuff we're going to be going over and where we got it from originally. And believe it or not, one of those strange circles of life, a lot of the research that I'm going to share with you originated with our working with veterans. One of my many short careers trying to figure out who the heck I am in the world and where I fit was as an officer in the United States Army. And so I work with veterans on particularly difficult cases that they have. Folks coming back from deployments. When I say guys, by the way, I'm talking about men and women. It's an easier way to do this. But these guys coming back often have some terrible struggles, and I'm sure you've heard about that. Rates of anxiety, depression, and suicidal behavior in these vets coming back is terribly high. A lot of us attribute that to something called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but it ain't what people think. In the movies, they show the horrific firefight or the explosion, the singular event that causes all the trauma. But we noticed at the hospital that a lot of the vets coming back who had these severe symptoms never heard a shot fired in anger in their deployments. But yet they were equally struggling as the vets who were in the horrific movie kind of situations. And we were puzzled by that. And it turns out that there's different types of stress disorders. One of them is called complex type. And that's the result of being in a stressful situation day in and day out in the military, as in a deployment. You're a stranger in a strange land, often with people who really do not want you there, feeling threatened, kind of always a little hypervigilant, scanning the horizon for the next terrible thing, seeing signs of awful things happening with, not to be too graphic, but body bags, or hearing about losses that occurred in units. But the folks who were in the units where the losses occurred were actually no worse off than the folks who were not in the units where terrible things happened. So we began to study this and realized the thing that damages these human beings, the soldiers in deployments, is the day-to-day, quiet, if you will, stressors. They're away from their families. There's all sorts of financial stresses because of that. They don't know how things work. They don't know the language. They're isolated. And as I'm using some of these words, I know you're picturing your kids' faces, and that's kind of where we're headed with this. I tell you this because after working with the vets for a while, I'm kind of arrogant at my age. I get to be arrogant. But you could kind of see it in their eyes. I would often, just talk to somebody for 10 minutes, and I could see the look in the eyes. They used to call it the 1,000-yard stare kind of a thing. But I knew that this is a real good bet. This is somebody dealing with PTSD, either from a singular event or just from the day-to-day stressors of being isolated in a strange world where everything seems to be upside down. And I tell you that because, guys, I've been seeing that look in your kids' eyes, your teenagers' eyes, over the past 10 years in particular. And since this pandemic hit, we've seen this just accelerate enormously to the point where we have no shame in comparing the world that your kids are living in with the world of vets being deployed. And it's more than just an opinion. When we're studying what's going on with teenagers today, we find they are suffering in numbers almost the same as deployed vets coming home in terms of rates of anxiety, depression, and suicidal behavior. Those three indices of suffering with our kids, with adolescents, and children, even younger, as young as age 8, we're measuring these stresses from the pandemic. They've increased 50% since last March nationally. So we're calling this the pandemic within the pandemic. And it's something that people really aren't seeing or paying the attention to that I wish they would, because everyone is focused on, kids are falling behind in their test scores and they're not going to be able to take the AP exams and so forth. And those things are all important. But guys, there are bigger stakes at play here. And I'm here tonight to try to help you learn about those things and then give you some tips on how we can all respond to help our kids get through these terrible stresses. That's the bad news side. The good news side, in researching this with veterans and with teenagers, we found an amazing vaccine. Having just gotten my first shot, my arm's a little sore. We found what we call a vaccine against this trauma effect of going through the pandemic, how it has changed our kids' world, and we call it resilience. And resilience is a near magical, tough to define characteristic or quality, but the best way I can illustrate it to you is to tell you about two vets I worked with. The first one, these are both guys who had lost a leg. It's called a traumatic amputation, one the right, one the left. The first case, they called me, this was some years ago, and they said, we have a traumatic amputation case. He won't get out of bed. He will not cooperate with treatment. He won't see anyone. He won't see his girlfriend, his family. He's promised to kill himself the first opportunity he gets. And by the way, remember, most of these vets are essentially teenagers. They can be 18, 19, 20 years old. They're still very young, even though they've gone through some terrible things. So they called me in to talk to this guy. And in talking with him, I was thinking, that's probably how I would react with such a horrific injury. Just turns your whole world upside down. And then about 18 months later, they called me. They said, we have another traumatic amputation case we want you to work with. And I said, let me guess, he won't get out of bed. And they said, no, get this. We can't keep him in bed. He's doubling and tripling his recommended physical therapy for recovery. He's constantly wandering the halls. He's formed all these self-help groups with the vets. He gets out of bed as soon as somebody else is coming in, the newbie, the new person coming into the ward. He greets them and shows them the ropes and says, hey, we're all brothers and sisters here. We're going to get you through this thing. And he seems to be in nonstop motion, and we're afraid he's going to hurt himself. And by the way, it said, get this, he's refusing to work on a normal false leg, a prosthetic. He wants the runner's prosthetic because he used to run. And he's saying he's not wasting his time with just the walking prosthetic. Learning how to walk on a prosthetic device is incredibly difficult. Running is like unbelievable. But this is where he was, and they were worried about him. So I went in to see him, and he was annoyed. I was taking up his time. And he's looking around, and he finally says, I know why you're here. So why am I here? He said, you're here because they're worried about all the stuff I'm doing, right? And I said, yeah. And he said, and I know what you think. And I said, well, tell me what I think. He said, you think I'm doing this as a way of avoiding my pain, don't you? And I said, well, the thought crossed my mind. He said, man, I'm not avoiding the pain. I feel the pain. I wake up in the middle of the night puking from pain from a leg I don't have anymore. Something called phantom pain, which is very, very tough for these guys to get through. He said, I feel the pain, but I gave that frickin' war my leg. I'm not going to give it another inch of my life. So if you want to help me, get that VA guy in here because I want that runner's prosthetic. And by the way, I want to find out what my benefits are because I'm thinking about going to law school. And he's got all these plans. Think about that for a minute. You have two soldiers, each suffering the same horrific injury. You would think the same stressor, the same loss, the same horror that they both went through, and the reactions were 180 degrees different. What was the difference? This thing called resilience. What is resilience? It's actually a bunch of things. It's a specific set of skills and assets, resources that some people have to cope with adversity. It is not some weird ability to either avoid adversity, to never have a tough time, and in fact, it requires going through painful situations to develop these skills and assets. So if you think bubble wrapping your kid is going to help them build resilience, forget it. That's a good way to cripple a child, is to have them never have stress. We'll talk about that in a minute. But also understand it is not some kind of John Wayne. That's kind of a dated reference, isn't it? But whoever the latest macho guy is in the movies, it is not some weird ability to not feel fear or pain at all. That's nonsense, by the way. You know, people in these situations feel fear and pain. The idea is to be able to cope with the fear and the pain that occur from the stressors, not to avoid it, and not to be able to be the ice man who never has those kinds of terrible negative feelings. Think about those two vets as boats on an ocean, and a huge wave overwhelms both of the vets. It swamps the boats. They both go down in the water. One of the boats continues down to the bottom. It's lost forever. The other boat goes down. It takes the hit, but it pops back up to the surface. And we use that metaphor to explain that resilience is really kind of an emotional buoyancy where horrific things can happen and they put people on their knees, they feel the pain, but they're able to come back up to the surface and reclaim their lives. The great news about resilience, guys, is it is not some genetically transmitted set of characteristics. That's another thing where we talk about people that stick with tasks. Some people call it grit. It's an entirely different animal. Resilience is something that you can teach. You can foster it in children and in students, and you can start it at any time in life. We do it with adults in prisons as well, trying to help them build these same sets of skills, because the folks in prisons, often, as scary as they may seem to you, are very vulnerable, fragile people who do not have the resilience to deal with difficulties in life. So before we get to all that, a couple of points of business. First of all, I don't know if our producer here is director having a problem with the tie. This is, yes, the ugliest tie you've ever seen in your life. How does his wife let him leave the house wearing that tie? She asked me a lot, by the way. Of course, there's a story. The tie was a gift from my son. My son Ross, when he was 13, we went through our dark days. If you've got kids in that phase, we'll talk about that. And that was the time where he just, couldn't find enough things wrong about me. The eye rolling and the sighing and just one time he corrected my grammar in front of a bunch of people, to make the point. Well, in any event, we have Christmas gatherings. We get the families together and we all do the Secret Santa thing. And, he, of course, manipulated to get my name for Secret Santa. And he presented me with this tie in front of everybody. And he said he had scoured the city of Philadelphia to find a tie that would match my taste in clothing. And everybody laughed, of course, at my expense. But don't feel bad. Ever since, I wear it to every public event I do. They passed this law, you can't beat them anymore. It's kind of a silly law, but it is what it is. I found that sarcasm fits in really well. So Ross, if you ever get to see this clip, this is the tie. By the way, Ross is now 30 and just had a baby and is like an amazing young man. And it shocked the heck out of me that he turned out so great, because those dark days can seem pretty awful. We'll talk about those. But you just have to kind of set a course, a set of principles that we're going to go over, stick to them. And I was as shocked as anybody. Oh my God, the stuff I write about actually works. So that's our story with Ross. And second, I'll beg your pardon in advance for swigging on the water. The voice is a little thin, and the mask doesn't help. But it's more overuse than age. And my daughter Sarah always had a nice way of helping me feel better about these events. Sarah is our adopted daughter, and speaking of trauma, we were foster parents, and we were her foster parents before we adopted her. She was in 4 foster homes in the first year of her life. She was born cocaine and opioid addicted, and she was returned from 4 placements before we got her. So imagine a baby which needs to attach and have the same faces and so forth, going through all that. Her level of trauma is off the charts. And that's one of the reasons we got interested in the whole concept of trauma and how to treat it. So when I would travel, when I get on a plane to go somewhere, she would always freak out, get upset, and because she had lost so many parental figures without even knowing it. So she would always ask me, am I going to be okay? And one time I would snuggle her to sleep before I leave on a trip. She said, "Daddy, are you going to die soon?" And I said, "Sweetie, I don't think I'm going to die soon, but I'll do everything I can to keep that from happening, okay?" And she said, "All right, Daddy." I said, "Sarah, why did you ask me that?" And she said, and I quote, "Well, Dad, because just like, look at you." So be very careful what you ask a child, because they think you want to know the truth. So there's a tip from the get-go about raising children. So what I'd like to do is to set the stage about the difficulty, the complexity of the issue you're dealing with, because teenagers are kind of in this perfect storm of resilience-destroying factors that you need to know about, because then it will make sense when we talk about how to respond to these things. The first thing we'll chat about is their brain. The brain, in case you haven't noticed, doesn't work so good. In fact, when kids are 13, their brain doesn't operate as well as it did when they were 10 or 11. And that's all Mother Nature's plan, to kind of move this creature from being a child to being an adult. And that's a miraculous transformation. But getting there can be really difficult. And that reorganization of the brain can cause kids to be much less resilient at age 13, 14, 15, 16 than they were at younger ages. Second anti-resilience factor is the world around them. Guys, this world is sort of a conspiracy, if you will, to break teenagers down. And it ain't the world you remember. When your kid says to you, you don't understand what it's like to be a teenager, agree with him. You don't. I'm in the business, and once a month I learn some other astounding thing that's come into their worlds that I really worry about. So a good response when they say, you don't know what it's like, say, you're absolutely right. I have no idea what it's like to be a teenager today. Tell me. Please educate me. That can open the door. It shows respect, and sometimes they'll begin to share some things. We'll go over that trick in a little bit. Third part of tonight is we'll go over something called the 7 C's, and I think you have that as a document you can download and click on, and we'll be going over those 7 factors we've discovered that are critical to building resilience in teenagers and in everyone, but things as parents we want to foster with our kids. And then finally, we'll get to the fourth and the best part of the evening, which is Q&A. Your questions, hopefully my answers. A couple of rules about Q&A. First of all, I am Irish by birth, not by choice, and in my family, Q&A means quarrels and arguments. So if you disagree with things that I'm saying tonight, please write me. Continue the discussion, or seek out other people to talk these things over with. This is really important stuff. Guys, raising a child, especially a teenager in today's world, is the most difficult and the most important thing you will ever do. And I don't care if you're going to run for the presidency of the United States. Raising a child is incredibly complex, incredibly more challenging than I think running this nation. But we'll see if I can convince you of that by the end. Second rule about questions, contrary to the myth, there is such a thing as a dumb question. What's the dumb question? It's the one you don't ask. If you have a question, get an answer. You can write me at the website, where there's lots of experts around. I'm sure there's folks in the school. If you've got community agencies, reach out and pursue this. Some parents actually start these groups after these seminars where they support each other and they chat out these questions. The old coffee clutches that used to go on, they can go on online. And these support groups for parents of teenagers can be very helpful. So maybe take a shot with that. Okay, the first anti-resilience factor is your child's brain. What's happening is that Mother Nature is renovating that brain from a child's brain to an adult brain. The problem is she's also got a sense of humor. She starts the renovation in the back of the head and works forward. So what gets addressed first in the back of the head? What we call the child brain. That's where the emotional, the feeling center is. And that's things about sex drive or dominance or need to take risks or be cool or to blow up when you're angry or upset. That's all in the back of the head. What's the last section that gets wired in? The prefrontal cortex in the front. We call that the adult brain, or the committee, which helps us survive. If we didn't have this part here, we wouldn't be having this discussion. We would have killed each other off a long time ago. So the problem is that when you start in the back of the head, and work forward, it's sort of like building this, phenomenal car. Put in this monstrous engine. This thing can do 200 miles an hour, and it looks really cool, and it can be kind of big and impressive. And then you remember it ain't got brakes. And that's what happens. Kids get these impulses to act out, to do things that stun them as much as they stun us. A number of people over the years have said, I'm not happy that you use the term crazy in all your book titles. I say, yeah, I actually wrestled with that a lot myself as a psychologist. But we came up with it because it seemed to be the one thing that parents and teenagers agreed upon. Teenagers feel they are crazy. Parents often see them as crazy because of these behaviors. But feeling crazy causes these kids to kind of close up. They're just so worried that we're going to pathologize them, say, oh, they need to go to the hospital or whatever. So we try to normalize the craziness, if you will, as a normal developmental stage. Don't take it so seriously. They do grow out of it. We all did. I was nuts as a teenager. I'll tell you those stories in a different seminar. And these kids are just the same. Remember your own teenage years, the real deal, not the stuff you tell your kids. And if you forgot, and if your parents are still around, ask them. You will be stunned as you recall the real deal of how crazy you were back in those years and how difficult it was to handle the world. It's a lot more difficult for these kids to do that today because the world itself has changed, which we'll chat about in a second. So what exactly are the things we see going on with kids that create resilience issues? One, have you noticed they get a tad moody? And the girls and the boys are a little different. There are sexual differences in mood. The boys often retreat to the room, and we call it go to the cave for a year, and you just don't see them. And they dress in black, and they grunt a lot, wolf down dinner, and disappear again. Sorry, it's normal. It's part of their development. We can talk about in detail. I think we have a question on that that we'll chat about tonight. The girls are a little more proactive. Not to be sexist, but they tend to engage with people to handle their stress. And often it's fights about who uses the bathroom or that there's nothing to eat in the pantry and you've got $5,000 worth of food in the pantry. So the girls tend to engage more socially, which I remember, a lot of parents telling me, when I asked them the differences, we actually did some research on this, which were more difficult to raise, boys or girls. Almost all parents, about 84%, said the girls are more difficult. One dad that had raised a boy and a girl said the following. He said, well, let's see, when my son was 14, he was a maniac. He would explode. He punched holes in the wall, kicked the door off the jamb one time. And then our daughter turned 14, and boy, did we miss our son, because it's a different presentation. And by the way, mothers and daughters, preempt that question if it came in. Most powerful relationship on the face of the planet, for better and for worse. When they're young, they tend to be very close, moms and the daughters. And that really is tough because you get so close to this little girl. She turns 13 and suddenly it flips 180 degrees. A lot of anger and judgment and fury. They come back. Some of the vets in the audience here are nodding their heads. Yeah, they do come back. So just ride it out. Don't get too disheartened by that. They become impulsive. Again, that child brain in the back of their head has them do crazy things. And the final kicker is they don't sleep. Mother Nature actually has them stay up later at night. And then we get them up early in the morning to ship them off to school, and it's crazy. They're supposed to be getting, usually on average, 9.5 hours of sleep, anywhere from 8 to 10, just to get by. What's the average sleep load of an American teenager? It's now inched under 6 hours. Think about that one thing, guys. If your kid is doing 6 hours instead of the 9 they need, they're getting 2/3 of their sleep. How about if you get 2/3 of your sleep every night for 3 months? At the end of the 3 months, if we do an evaluation, are you going to be ADHD, depressed, anxious, maybe explosive, maybe even feeling like you don't want to live anymore? Sleep insufficiency will create those disorders. And that's another part of the puzzle that explains why these kids are suffering as much as they are. The second big factor in hurting teen resilience is the world. The world is incredibly stressful. But, again, as I said, the idea is not to bubble wrap them, but to expose them to appropriate doses of stress so that they can build these skills to handle the stressors. In case you haven't noticed, life can be really stressful. So the idea is not to create a stress-free life. That actually creates crippled individuals. The idea is to find your sweet spot. See, when we study stress, it turns out that it's one of those bell curves. Remember that from school? And if you think about this part of the graph as being level of stress, and the vertical axis is happiness, satisfaction, feeling good about life, being productive, and so forth. It turns out that stress is a bell curve. What does that mean? At the low end, where people have essentially zero stress, they have tremendous levels of anxiety, depression, and suicidal behavior. What about the hyper-stressed person? Ditto. Almost the same numbers. Where's the sweet spot? Up here somewhere. It's an appropriate amount of stress where we rise to challenges that we're worried about, a little nervous, like, oh, I don't know if I can do this, but we stand up to the challenge. Like Candy was worried about doing the introduction, did a fabulous job, by the way. And then you stand up and you meet the challenge, and then at night, Candy's going to be lying in bed saying, yeah, that was pretty cool. I got that thing done. I feel good about that. She's shaking her head no. She will. Trust me. And that's the nature of that. And that builds that set of skills for the next challenge. As you'll see when we go over the 7 C's, experiencing stress in the proper dose is critical. We'll come back and expand on that. What is causing the stressors? A bunch of things, but a key one is screens. Screens are miraculous. It's incredible. I'm stunned all the time. I can get so much more done. Excuse me. I can just talk to my phone and get statistics on serious research now, where I used to have to drive to a university library and spend days and days in musty books and journals trying to figure this stuff out. So the screens are here to stay, but the screens also have a dark side. Do you remember being a teenager? Do you remember dealing with things like, sexual pressures or bullying, FOMO, I'm not where I should be? Well, that was nothing when we were teenagers compared to what kids deal with today because of the screens. The stressors we dealt with, the same stressors in name, but we were dealing with muskets in terms of the delivery system of the lethality. Kids today are dealing with machine guns because they just get hammered with the screens, particularly with the social media sorts of things and the dark side of those events. These are stressors, guys, that work on our kids just the way it works on soldiers deployed in Afghanistan. It's a constant, low-level, kind of a background static of, okay, what's next? What's going to happen? Are we going to make it? Oh my God, what was that noise? And what's this text? What's this new Facebook thing? What's this new Instagram? They become hyper-vigilant. And they literally scan their screens the way soldiers in Afghanistan scan the mountains looking for the next threat. And it wears them down. There's some other changes we've discovered in kids in looking at 50-year research about teenagers that you need to know. And by the way, of course, what I'm doing here is building the case to get you fired up to do the work you need to do to try to help your kids deal with this stuff. So bear with me, because I, again, need to disabuse you of the notion that you know what it's like to be a teenager today. A woman that I hate, name is Jean Twenge. I hate her because she's brilliant, and she got this idea that I should have gotten, where she wanted to see how things are different over 50 years in the lives of teenagers. Is it really more stressful, or are we just making that up? Are we just looking for pathology more? Some people say, oh, we coddle these kids. They play the D word, depression word, or suicide, the S word, to get out of doing work and so forth. So she addressed it very well. She pulled out all these old tests that we still use today and questionnaires to get at information about teenagers 50 years ago and teens today. One of the things that she turned out was, first of all, yes, they are suffering more. When we talk about the increase in anxiety, depression, and suicidal behavior, it's absolutely hard science. It's not that we're just seeing it, looking for it, and so forth. She figured that out. It's no longer in dispute. Second thing that she found is that today's kids feel less control over their lives than my generation did. And that's stunning to me, because I grew up in Southwest Philadelphia. We were poor. I didn't know we were poor. You know, I had a great childhood. One pair of shoes, no car, that kind of thing. But I can remember hanging with my gangster friends, as my father referred to them, in the park, sometimes drinking a beer. Don't tell anybody I said that. And we would talk about what we were going to do. And I remember that would come up all the time. Somebody would say, yeah, I'm going in the Marines, or I'm going to become a doctor, I'm going to become a cop, I'm going to be a firefighter. And people just had this sense of, we can get out of the hood. You know, we have that control. Today, kids do not report feeling that. We call it a locus of control. In other words, do they have determination over the outcome of their lives, or is it just a crapshoot? Today, most kids feel it's like a crapshoot. They really can't determine the outcome of their lives. Even though they're so much richer, if you will, so many of the kids have so many more opportunities. That having the money in the 3-car garage is no kind of protection against that hopelessness. And if you think you have no control, think about that message in terms of resilience, being able to handle stressors, rich or poor. That sense of not having control over the outcome of your life is devastating. It's kind of debilitating. Second, their goals are now more materialistic or extrinsic. Back in the day, we would ask kids, what's it all about? You know, what is it that makes life interesting or worth living? And believe it or not, kids would talk about, well, I want to do something important. Be a cop, help people, become a soldier and save the world and all that sort of stuff. So they would have these ideas about doing something that really impacted the lives of other people. People wanted money as well, but it was more about doing something that made somebody feel good inside. Today, we ask kids, what's it all about? And they tell us 3-car garages, foreign cars, lots of women, party hard, leave a good-looking corpse. This fatalistic, materialistic, extrinsic reward kind of view of the world, which jades them and, unfortunately, destroys resilience. Because again, without that internal passion, it's difficult to marshal what it takes to deal with stressors. That's been a big shift. Next, they're much less self-reliant. And that falls back on us as parents, those of us who have some money, that we have some advantages. Unfortunately, we thought it was a good idea to give kids everything, to bubble wrap them, to keep them from being stressed. If a teacher, not that these teachers would necessarily be mean to a kid, but teachers, my wife is a teacher, they're often slow to appropriately discipline a child, because a lot of the parents will show up that night with the lawyer. And that happens a number of times to teachers, cops, trying to do their jobs, and they just quit. So, it's not worth it. I can't get it done. When my son Ross, did I mention we went through some dark days? He informed us he was not going to do social studies. He said it was irrelevant to his lifestyle. I hope Ross sees this. It was irrelevant to his life. And Ross is a genius, no joke. I don't recommend it, by the way. If you have a choice, don't get a genius child. But he announced this at dinners. I tend to not cooperate with my social studies teacher. So Cindy and I looked at each other, my wife, so why? And he said, well, I've thought about this, and I've discovered, I've done a lot of research, social studies is just a governmental mind control program to keep rich white old guys like you, he points to me, in power. And I said, well, that's an interesting view. He said, I'm not going to cooperate with it. And he folds his arms, waiting for us to yell and scream at him. Since we're in the business, we kind of looked at each other and said, well, okay. He said, okay. I said, yeah, okay. All right, I'm not going to do the work. I said, I got it, son. But here's the deal. When the teacher calls, we're going to say, oh, yeah, we were expecting your call. We're going to hand the phone to you. This is your deal. You're going to handle the thing. That's fine. End of the semester, we get called in by this poor teacher. And I remember the meeting. You guys will love this. It was like 8:30 at night, and this guy's sitting there behind his desk, and his tie is down. He's got the 8 o'clock night shadow, and he's exhausted, bags under his eyes. I think he was a new parent. And he said, I just had to call you in to talk about Ross's grade. And we're in one of those entitled school districts. That's why we went there. It's a great school district. I said, okay, well, what is it? And he said, well, if I did it by the numbers, it would be an F. And he drops his voice, waiting for us to scream. And so I said, well, what did Ross earn? He said, well, he wouldn't do any of the work. I said, I get it. So he should get the F. And the teacher looked at us. He said, you do know that this will take, because he's in the gifted program, he said, this will take him out of the gifted track, which I'm very happy with, by the way. I'm not a big fan of those things. And I said, got it. And he sat back and he put his pencil down. And he said, I've been teaching here for 9 years. You are the first set of parents that did not argue for a better grade for their child. And Cindy and I looked at each other and thought, oh my God, what are we creating? Guys, when we went home, of course, Ross was, what did he say, what did he say? And we said, oh, he said you're a great guy, which is true, and he really thinks you're very smart, which is true. But, he said, you're getting an F. He said, an F? And he ran up to his room, and then he spent like the weekend, I think he slept 4 hours. He wrote this paper defending his position about social studies being this governmental mind control program to keep rich white guys like me in power. And he ran it in, caught the teacher in the parking lot and handed it to him and said, please, you got to read this before the grades go in. And so the teacher did. He read through it and he said, Ross, this is an amazing piece of work. He said, in fact, I'd like to submit it to one of the journals that I work with because this is really well done. And Ross said, great, I get an A. And the teacher said, no, you get an F. I didn't ask for this. I asked for all these other things you didn't do. And Ross was furious. We let him take the shot. When he came home screaming and yelling, we explained civil disobedience. I said, hey man, I respect that. But the core, if you read Martin Luther King, of civil disobedience is you pay the dues. You go to jail. They don't say, oh, you're a great person for not following the law. You pay the dues. I tell you this story, guys, because particularly with the pandemic, people are so terrified about the kids' test scores plummeting and they're not going to get the AP test. Ross was a mediocre student and worse through middle school and high school. In college, he turned on the jets. He now has a master's degree. He's accomplished in many, many ways because he discovered through that experience, I believe, and others, that he wanted to excel. It wasn't because the old man was nagging and screaming or mom was beating over the head about get good grades. He found out himself by failing. He wrestled with that. It's all about beliefs. It's all about the beliefs of the child. And I hope we have some questions on that as we get through, and we'll touch more on that. Okay. So how is all this impacting on our kids? And this is unfortunately the white knuckle time. So bear with me. When we look at the risk indicators of sex, drugs, and rock and roll is the metaphor for violence in different ways. And we're not talking just about physical violence. That's actually sort of down in a lot of communities. But cyber violence, verbal violence, social violence, ostracizing, the demeaning, the rumors, all that stuff. And, I got bullied in high school. I had a couple of terrible bullies. One was John McMahon. I'd see him coming down the hallway, and I'd punch myself in the face and fall down, and, John would stand there, and I'd say, are we done here? He'd say, yeah, we're done here, and he would leave. But literally, I got beaten up a number of times. When I hear the stories of your kids, what they deal with on those screens, I'll take the beatings. I'm serious. They were less damaging than this skilled kind of terroristic stuff that goes on with the kids. And we used to say the girls were worse, and now the boys are, talk about equal opportunity, the boys are getting into this as well. So watch out for that stuff. That explains a lot of the moods that you're seeing, the explosiveness, the crazy response because you ask them to clean the room and they go insane. It's often all these hidden stressors that you don't know about and they don't share, and sometimes they don't even know about it. They're not making the direct connection of what goes on in their worlds and how it affects their moods. Drug use, it's never been higher. The pandemic has put some brakes on some aspects of it, but guys, the drug use exploded over a 15, 20-year period. It hasn't gone down. It keeps slowly ratcheting up. The short course is teenagers can't do drugs, be it alcohol, certainly any of the marijuana is a deadly drug. Cocaine, the opioids, and so forth. They're all deadly to teenagers. When kids get older, their brains develop some defenses against the neuroaddictive effects of these things. But guys, they can't do these things. Now parents say, well, how are you going to stop them? The idea is you really can't stop them, but you can tell them it's your expectation they not use. And it's an education process. You let them know that this stuff is dangerous. And it is dangerous. What you do not do is deal with the devil. You don't give them permission to use certain amounts. That's what a lot of parents do, saying, well, they're safer in our basements than they are out in the park. Be very careful with those deals. Read up on the research on this stuff, because if you say drinking beer in the basement is okay, they will take that to the next level. So again with Ross, I would always say to him, it's my expectation you do not drink, for example, until you're 21. And he would laugh. He said, you know what goes on. I said, I do. I'm just telling you, that's my expectation, my loving expectation. When he went to college, of course, it goes off the rails in college. And after college, he came home and he said, I want you to know something. He was kind of half upset. So every time I was at a party, he said, your face would pop up saying it was your loving expectation. He said, you kept ruining my high. Well, he actually left his college, moved out, because as he said, he just couldn't handle the partying. His quote was, I got tired of walking in puke every weekend because people were partying till they puke, literally. And he wasn't into it. So guys, your loving expectation is very powerful. It's not a police operation. You do what you have to if you have a serious drug issue with a kid, and there's books written about what to do specifically. But the most important thing is to tell a kid that you love them, and because you love them, you're telling them they can't do this stuff because of the way it impacts on teen brains. So the problem is that with the stressors that they're dealing with, the drugs work great. It gives them relief from the anxiety and depression and even suicidal thoughts. The irony is those drugs, marijuana included, maybe especially, create anxiety, depression, and suicidal thought over time. With teenagers, science for teens, the science of these drugs for adults are two entirely different libraries. So research what it can do to teenagers and then get ready to fight that fight. So what is it doing in terms of the specific suffering indices? Anxiety, depression, and suicide were already up about 5 times the rate over 50 years from my generation to your kids' generation. In other words, the levels, the frequency of anxiety, depression, and suicidal thought were up about 400 to 500% over the past 50 years. Since March, when the pandemic hit, we've now lopped on another 50% on those numbers. This is a pandemic within the pandemic, and we are very worried about this impact on kids. in particular the suicidal behavior. And if you think about everything I just went over with you, doesn't it sort of make sense? You take these creatures who are brain challenged to begin with, and we all were. It's been that way since teenagers ever happened in this world. And you put them in this high stress world with those stressors we went over that cause this kind of pain. And on top of that, we roll in the pandemic. And what is the pandemic doing to these kids? They are built by Mother Nature to be social beyond everything else, to be hanging out and getting in trouble, climbing out the window in the middle of the night, dating, running with the gangsters, all that stuff, because they learn by interacting. And that's why they have this tremendous desire to interact. And now we can't do that because their interactions can kill people. If not mom and dad, grandmom and grandpa. It's a terrible conundrum for these kids, and they were suffering. They were doing okay for a while. It's like they were being the good soldiers, but then, in the military, sometimes we extend the tours. Say, oh, sorry, Candy, you're not going home in the 3 months you thought you were going to be here. We're extending you another 3 months. What? This is what we've done consecutively with these kids. We keep extending their tours because we thought it was going to be over a lot faster than it is. They're exhausted. They're just wearing out. So I want you to take that suicide issue and be proactive on that. A lot of people say, oh, I don't want to ask my kid if she's thinking about suicide because we'll put the thought in her head. The thought is in her head. Kids talk about suicide at incredibly early ages. Self-harm, self-injury, and suicide, we find in 8, 9, 10-year-olds. It's part of their vocabulary, their lexicon, their experience because of these screens. They've been exposed to that. The quieter you get about suicide, the more deadly it can be. So feel free to just ask a kid straight out about that. When you find a moment, a quiet moment of exchange, say to them first, can I ask you a question? It's a respect-based way of asking to get into their business, because believe it or not, you don't have a right to their business. But you can ask, can I ask you a question? And they know it's going to be kind of a serious question, and they feel sort of respected. Most of the time they'll say, sure. And you say, would you tell me, have you ever felt so crummy you wished you weren't alive? That's question one. If they say no, and you believe them, trust your gut, then great, you let it go. And if they're truthful, most of the kids are going to say, well, yeah, there's been times I wish I wasn't alive. If they'll permit, give them a hug, say, thank you for telling me that. That was hard to do. And can I ask you a second question? Have you actually thought about ending your life at any time? Again, if they say, no, never got that bad, and you trust it, you're done. If they say, well, yeah, I have thought about ending my life, again, hug them, say, thanks for telling me that. I really appreciate it. Question 3, have you thought about how you would end your life? If they identify a methodology, I'd get Dad's gun, I'd get some, I have some pills I've been saving up, or I'd, get a rope. Then again, give them a hug and say, thanks for telling me. And then you get them to an emergency evaluation. You stay with them 24/7 until they're seen in a crisis center or by a professional that can make the determination as to whether they are safe or not. Don't guess. And if a kid uses suicide for attention, that's a kid who's in a minefield. Kids who talk about it, who threaten it, are more inclined to actually do it. So don't say she's just doing it for attention or to get out of homework. Say, thank you for telling me, and let's go see the experts and get an evaluation. We've just lost too many of these kids, folks. We can't lose any more. The more you discuss the subject, the less likely it is to happen. The research is clear. Okay, so that brings us to the 7th season. I am talking too much again. So here we're at the good news, the empowering part. And if you have that document, if you want to click on that and take a look at the 7 C's, what you're looking at is the core of the research that we've been doing, and I have to give a tribute to Ken Ginsberg at CHOP in Philadelphia, and he's the guru with the American Academy of Pediatrics that was involved in this research. And we distilled it down to this kind of handy 7 C's thing, but it really works when you go over that. These are specific assets and skills that we found in the second soldier, if you will, that was able to survive the terrible trauma and rise above and come out of it stronger than before. Don't get too overwhelmed with this. When you go through it, it seems like, oh my God, I can't do this as a parent. These are just guidelines. Just read it over and then tap it as you need to when decisions come up about things your kid wants to do or things you would encourage your kid to do. Try to be using this paradigm as kind of your overall guidance sheet. So take your time going over it. I'm going to highlight a couple of things with the 7 C's. The first C is called competence. And what is competence? That's a specific skill or an ability, a capability to handle something that you didn't know how to handle before. And that's where you learn stuff. And that can be, sports, hitting a baseball, it can be cooking, it can be art, it can be video productions, talking to the people here. It can be doing something and saying, man, I didn't know how to do that, and I know how to do that now. Competencies are really important. They're acquired through actual experience. You can't just tell somebody about the thing and expect that to happen. They have to be engaged in the world. So as you look through some things that parents can do, stop thinking that the Johns Hopkins Summer Science Program is so much more valuable than the kid trying to have a rock and roll band in the summer. Research says he'll learn more with his rock and roll band than he's going to learn at Johns Hopkins, more that's truly useful in life. My son was a heavy metal, he says it's not heavy metal, but whatever, some horrific music that he plays. He got paid money to do this, by the way. That the learning that went on, I was stunned when I watched him do this useless rock and roll band that makes parents crazy. Personnel management, psychology, planning, executive function, negotiation. It was incredible, the stuff that he was learning through that he uses today in the things that he does today. So it doesn't matter what they want to do, just be sure they're doing stuff. The mantra is, do something, don't do no thing. Like a mobilized child, that's a problem. So what do you do in these days of pandemic? You're saying, yeah, Bradley, what the heck do we do? We can't go out anymore. We can't have the rock and roll band. Find things they can do. There's lots of online skills. Kids are learning to play musical instruments, guitars, or doing art projects with online training. I have kids that I work with that are learning languages that you couldn't beat them into the classroom at school. But I have a kid that says, yeah, I'm learning Chinese, and he's talking to me in Chinese just for the hell of it because he just wanted to learn something. And you can see the energy in the eyes as they talk about, I can order food in a Chinese restaurant in Chinese, it's so cool. These things all help people feel they've got stuff inside of them, competencies to handle life. They're going to make mistakes. Try not to dwell on the mistakes. Say as little as possible about the mistakes. When they do make a mistake, and it's concerning to you because it lost a lot of money or whatever, don't yell, don't say, you always do this kind of stuff, but rather say, hey, if you had it to do over again, what would you do differently? And what did you learn? Great question with a kid when they've had some, terrible event. Say, well, what did you learn? Because that's the key, that they learn something. Not that they get screamed at for being stupid. Let them make decisions. Ross with social studies. Another mantra is bad decisions made well are much more valuable than good decisions made poorly. What's a good decision made poorly? We beat Ross into doing the gifted social studies program. He might get the good grades, stay on the gifted track, and he won't learn a thing except that he resents his parents. Letting him make the bad decision, if it's not life-threatening, they learn so much more. Think about your own lives. If you're successful and you're feeling good about your life today, how did that happen? Did it happen because you won all the time? Or do you have these awful failures that you keep in the front of your brain, like I do, saying, that was really stupid, I'll never do that again? We are much more formed by our failures that we learn from than by our successes. We learn more from that. So stop fearing failure for your kid. They're getting stronger. Second is confidence. What is confidence? Confidence is competence projected into the future. And that's what comes from learning stuff. It's saying, hey, I can learn stuff. So this next challenge, I had challenges before. I learned it. I can learn this next one. So that's how you build confidence. Do not think you build confidence by telling them nonsense. Like, oh, you're the best player in the whole county. It's not true. Sorry. If it is true, then praise them for the work they put in to become the best player. But don't BS them. They know it's BS. And it actually is counterproductive. But do praise them for efforts, even when they fail. They try out for the basketball team and they get cut and they're demolished, they're demoralized, and ask them to share their feelings about it. And at the end, you say, something? I am so impressed that you took that shot and you worked your rear end off and you didn't get it and you're taking it like a grown-up. I am really impressed. That skill will get you a lot further than an easy pass joining the team, because it's all about sticking with things, going back again, past rejection, to keep knocking on doors. That's the real secret. Encourage them to push themselves. Do not push them. Don't torture them into doing things, but help them process it. A good question is, kid says, I want to try out for the ice hockey team, but I'm really nervous. So what are you afraid of? Help them identify the fear, and then say, that thing you're afraid of, is that a horror or is that a frustration? Would it be a horror if you get cut? Well, no, it'd be a frustration. Okay. So should you let frustration stop you from trying to do things in the world? Think about it, son. So don't get wedded to pushing the kid into the thing. Get them to think about the idea of challenges and letting fear make their choices. Next C, connections. Guys, connections, if I had to choose a C, it's all about connections. Connections is about relationships between people. Think about that second veteran, the guy that did so well in the face of horrific loss. What was the secret? He worked on connections. He was welcoming people. He was promoting self-help groups. He was constantly affirming his connections to other people. That is magic. As human beings, we're not built to be isolated. It's another problem with the pandemic and all the suffering we're seeing with mental illness. We're just not built to do this very well, very long. But we've got a bunch of recommendations here. You want to promote the connections as best you can with the pandemic. I know you can't risk kids bringing disease into the house, but as much as you can, I know you hate the screens, that's where the screens are a good thing, where you can promote good interactions of kids getting together on common tasks to do things. The rock and roll bands, kids playing their instruments, and then putting it together, or video productions. Everybody does a piece and then put it together. Find ways to try to interact with the cyber things that can help them still feel part of something and engaged in the world. When your kid says he hates you, don't go crazy. Welcome that. Say, thanks for telling me that. And see if they'll expand on that. That feels like a connection to the kid, that they could say something that awful to the parent. And the parent says, I'm sorry, I love you. In fact, I love you too much to let you do this thing you wanted to do because it would hurt you. But I get it that you hate me. That's okay. You're accepting their wholeness. They're allowed to be ugly. And it helps them feel secure that you can accept that without going crazy. Use consequences, not punishments. What's a punishment? Punishment is a kid does something stupid and then we hurt them. A kid comes in, they were drinking beer, and we say, all right, you were drinking beer, give me your guitar you love, and give me that phone, and you're grounded for the next 17 years. We make stuff up, and it's too late. the kid didn't know this before they made the choice. Consequence is different. That's where in advance you say, I'm glad you're going to that party. Just to let you know, I do worry teenagers drink at these parties. If you make good choices, you've earned the right to the next sleepover, whatever. If you make a poor choice, just to let you know, we're going to have to retire those away sleepovers for a couple of months. But then you'll get it, and you'll grow, and you'll make better decisions. That's a consequence. And that way, you put the power in her hands to decide her future. Punishments just generate rage in teenagers and parents because they have no control. Consequence is different. That's where the teenager gets mad at herself for making a dumb decision that cost her. And getting angry at ourselves psychologically, that's the beginning of growth. So always go for consequences. Read more about this, the difference. Punishments don't work. Should we go to the questions, or do you want me to keep pushing? Or keep pushing? Okay. Next C is character. And character is all about who we are, what we do when nobody's looking. When you find the wallet and you look around and nobody's there, it's decision time. What do? And that has to do with your own set of values, your belief system, again, which is the core of our mission and working with kids. So you want them to develop a fundamental sense of right and wrong, some code. Doesn't have to be a religious set of principles. It's just kind of figuring out what you believe in, what is the right thing to do. Unfortunately, teenagers will often find that out by doing the wrong thing. If they do the wrong thing, again, that's where you have to resist the urge to yell and scream, how could you have stolen that money from Uncle Lou? I can't believe it. But rather just sit them down. They're waiting for you to scream and yell. It's always better to sit them down after you've been punching the garage wall to calm yourself down. You sit down and say, son, tell me what you learned. And they'll look at you like, what? Tell me what you learned. How did you feel taking that money that wasn't yours? What do you think about that? And if the kid says, well, I felt really crummy, actually. I couldn't sleep last night and I'm kind of sick to my stomach. And then they say, well, what's my punishment, Dad? You say, there's no punishment, man. You learned it. You give them a hug if they'll allow. If they give you a smart-ass answer, oh, I learned it's better to take the money, then you say, well, then we may have some work we have to do. And one of the things you can do is share your own story. If you really want to get your kid angry, talk about your own failures. Because they don't know what to do. You ever tried lecturing at them about being a good, moral, upright person? Good luck. The Star Wars deflector shields pop up. They don't hear a word. It's wah, wah, wah. But if you say, you know something? What you did reminded me of when I was 13 and I stole this money from my older brother and I thought it was so cool and I bought all this stuff and I felt horrible. I didn't even know, it didn't make sense to me at the time. But I figured out I had a code and I violated my own code. And it was awful for me. Anyway, thanks for listening, and you leave. A lot of parenting is guerrilla warfare. You run up to their walls. They have these walls, and you lob this thought or question over the wall, and you run the hell away. Not protracted, nose-to-nose, screaming, yelling lectures. Less is more in parenting. Sometimes it's just an observation or a question, and if they give you a smart answer, then you say, oh, okay, what would you like for dinner? Don't keep in the exchange. You've done the damage by just lobbing in the question or the thought. It'll roll through their head. Okay. I'm going to skip over this because you can read it on your own. Contribution. This is really critical because kids innately don't get the contribution thing. It's important that they hear a lot about the real world versus the Disney world that so many of us grow up in, and that they know that there's real pain and need out there. And this is where community service is so critical. My only argument with community service is so often it's picking up trash on the roadside. it has to be, I mean, that's fine, it's helpful. The core is interacting with people in need, in pain, and getting out of our own heads and understanding, my God, there's a whole other world out there I didn't know about. It's incredibly transformative for teenagers. So here, encourage them to do community service. It's still going on, even in the pandemic. I have kids that are helping with food drives. You know, they do it safely, they're masked and distanced and so forth. If they're driving, my son is doing this. You know, they pull up, open up the trunk, they fill the trunk, and you know, they drive to a house and put the packages on the doorstep and, you know, ring the doorbell and run, kind of a thing. So there's a lot going, you have to search for it, but there's stuff going on, and it turns these kids around. My son went on a trip to Cuba back when it was illegal back in the day. He was a different human being when he came back. That experience of working with people in need, it really transformed him. Sometimes we call these gap programs when they're older. Look for these sorts of things where they see they have this power of contributing. Now sometimes kids will say, well, it's stupid, you know, gave that guy sandwiches on the street, that homeless person, you know, that doesn't change anything. And you say, well, I can see that, you know, I get that argument, but, you know, that guy you gave the sandwiches to, he might feel differently about that. So help them understand that, you know, making small changes, one pebble at a time. You know, everybody chucks a pebble. You got a lot of things going on there. And if you have to pay them, put them on a salary. All right, I'm going to get all the hate mail now from all the psychologists out there. Don't bribe them. Okay, incentivize them. Does that work? Can we use that word? Seriously, you know, offer them money, put them on a salary to go to the soup kitchen, to work at the food bank. It is well worth the expenditure. Coping skills, and that's all about, you know, ways of handling stress. I won't do too much with that, but a key one I want to mention is the Serenity Prayer. You don't have to be religious. The Serenity Prayer is like the smartest bunch of words I ever heard. If you don't know it, get a copy, post it somewhere. It's grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That is so freaking smart. That's hundreds and hundreds of years old. That is the secret, particularly today. You can't get rid of the pandemic. Sorry. Some people are obsessed on the pandemic. That's all they talk about. That's all they focus on. They're glued to the TV. Some information is helpful, but it becomes overkill. There's nothing you can do. What can you do? Go to the food bank. Help people who need to eat. How about that? So that is so helpful to teenagers as a way of coping with all of these stressors, where you say, yeah, you can't stop the bullying. Sorry, you can sign off Instagram. But yeah, you really can't control other people's behavior. You can control your own. So how do we help you do that? And finally, control. And that's about helping them understand, as opposed to the research, yes, you do have essential control over the outcome of your life. There's things you can do by working hard, by trying things, where you can take charge of the direction of your life. And then, again, be sure you walk the walk by letting them own the consequences of their behaviors, using consequences, not punishments. That builds a sense of control in the kid, because they said, yeah, I screwed up, I went drinking, so I lost the privilege of sleepovers, but I can choose to not drink and have the control to go to the next sleepover. So it proves essential control. All right, so I would like to push on and get to some of the Q&A, quarrels and arguments. And Candy, my Ed McMahon here, you know, that's a dated reference, I guess. But
yeah, indeed. So, Dr. Bradley, many of the questions focused on the impacts of virtual learning. Are there negative impacts? Are there positive impacts? How can parents help students in this difficult time of hybrid or virtual learning? And how can teachers
Well, we're very worried about the impact of virtual learning, but not in the ways that a lot of people assume. Again, people are looking at things like test scores or not learning specific information that will help them with AP courses and the SATs and yada, yada, yada. The real impact of virtual learning is the loss of connection, of the socialization that is so critical to these kids. It is like oxygen to them to survive. So having the distance, doing the cyber learning is really hard because it can feel stilted and not real. They're used to watching BS on their screens all the time. So that virtual or distance learning can really make them disengage. One of the things you can do, again, is to always provide the hope this will not be forever. For kids, tomorrow or next week is forever. You need to give them a perspective about this has happened before. One of the things that's been helpful is people talking about past pandemics, and that the world has been through crises before and has survived. And you can start a discussion about how did people handle this before, do you think? Try to give them a sense that they are not alone in this experience. This has happened before. And it happens all the time to many people and we never hear about it. They have personal pandemics or crises. Try to get the kid to have a perspective, that to step out of their own experience and show them, yes, this is difficult. Second, offer the incentive, the bribe. Say, yeah, I know it's really hard to log on to this camera class, but hey, how about if we do something where you earn something you want by putting in these dues, because this is so hard for you to do. One of the things we've done is talk about the McDonald's game pieces. Remember that thing they used to do? So if the kid says, yeah, I want the new lacrosse stick. So you go online, you get a picture of a lacrosse stick, you print it out, one black and white, one color, and then you cut up the color one into, say, 20 pieces. And they get the black and white. And then every day they get through attending class, getting up out of bed when they don't feel like it and signing on, they get a game piece. I know it sounds stupid. Kids love this stuff. And then they glue it in to where it fits in the black and white. And when they get the last game piece, you go get the lacrosse stick. Find something you can help them get over that anticipatory anxiety and frustration. The irony is, when they do log on, they feel better. They feel like, well, I'm doing something. But getting over that hump is really hard for them. What about the teachers? My wife is one of those, and she co-teaches, with a real good guy. And I hear them down at I hear on the computer in the morning, and they're like Broadway actors and actresses. Everything is loud and aggrandized and moving. And she's got the computer turned around so the screen is facing out back. Right now we have the snow, and we have all these birds we feed, and the cardinals are sitting in the tree, and it's gorgeous. So she'll stop and she'll say, oh my God, look, there's 3 cardinals. And I'm sorry, it's exhausting. She says she works harder trying to get this thing through a screen than she works in the classroom. But it works. You can hear the kids sort of coming out of their comas, and they start to laugh. Yesterday morning, she went running down the steps with her computer, and I thought, oh my God, what's the problem? She said, no, it's okay, it's okay. And she went down to where we have pictures. There was a picture of her grandfather, who was in World War I, in uniform, the unit, because they were talking the history lesson on World War I. Nothing more boring than World War I on a cyber class to these kids. But she showed them this picture, and it was like, oh my God, look at this. And she points them out. Sorry, teachers, you got to amp up. You got to, be this. You're exhausted at the end of the day. You always are, but even more so now. You can bridge the gap. You become animated, yell, do goofy dances, show up. Another person showed up with a sombrero, and she used this purple lipstick. just to shock the kids. And the kids call the other kids like, oh my God, look at Miss Jones. You got to check this out. So get crazy, if you will, to break the monotony and reach out. And teachers, this will end. We will survive this thing. And you will have a lot of comfort after this is over about how you handle it tomorrow. Next question.
So many of the questions you answered during your presentation. I found this one to be particularly telling because I feel this in my own world as well. The question is, I've been trying to manage my children's COVID situation-induced anxiety by telling them that I have similar feelings. What's the best way to expand upon that narrative to help then deal with the stress that we're all experiencing at this time? And I really resonated with this because as a parent, how much do you hold back? How much do you let them know that you're worried about?
Okay. First, don't BS kids. They know when we're BSing them. So you don't sell them a high on life sort of a thing. Be direct in a controlled way. You can say, yes, scares the heck out of me. It's very unsettling. Try to make it a dialogue. Say, how about you? Does it work on you? Even if they don't participate, always give them the invitation to share. But then you say, yeah, it's really frightening, and it is horrific. This does qualify as a horror, period. Give it a break, and then new paragraph. But I found some things, you could say to the kid, that helped me. Would you like to know what they are? And that's when you get to the serenity prayer. Say, yeah, I'm, watching too much of the TV and I'm just shaking my head and I can't sleep at night. I get my rear end down to the food bank and suddenly I'm like, well, what was I so upset about? I don't have problems. This is nothing. So, Rick Warren, this is not all about me. We're not the center of the universe, is very helpful. So share the real deal. Don't minimize the fear and the frustration. But then talk about the hopeful part. Well, this is what I do to respond to it. And maybe some of that could help you. Come with me down to the food bank tomorrow and see how it feels.
Excellent, thank you. Are there specific early warning signs to watch for regarding anxiety and depression?
Yeah, the sudden changes in behaviors and kids change a lot, so it's really hard to sort. But when you see something where there's radical changes in sleep patterns and eating patterns, and that could be either way, eating too much, sleeping too much, or too little of both of those things, can be indicators. Look for signs of chewing on nails. Unfortunately, if you want to be sure they're not self-injuring, it's something else that's going on. Kids are so starved because of the lack of socialization. They start to feel numb. And that numbness can overtake them, and they hate it. Again, they're built to be in motion, nonstop, socially. That numbness makes them feel like they're not alive. Kids tell me they feel like they're zombies. So what they'll do is they'll take an instrument and cut themselves. Now that, we call it self-injury. That is not suicide. One kid said to me, yeah, I do this so I don't kill myself, because it does help kids deal with anxiety and depression like a medicine can. In a weird way, it's therapeutic, but it's also very dangerous. They can hurt themselves and get infections and so forth, and it can be addicting. So another sign to look for is the daughter who used to wear T-shirts all the time. Suddenly, she's got the long sleeves down, even when it's relatively warm in the house. That can be a sign. Or wearing lots of cover-up clothes on legs, places they might be self-injuring. If you see those signs, don't go crazy. They're not going to die quickly, but you do want to address it, and you want to find an opening. And sometimes it works best late at night, because again, they don't sleep, they're up. One of my friends who writes books, as I do, wrote, if you want to talk to your kids, set your alarm clock for midnight. Mike Riera. And it's true, I tried it back in the day, because they're so deprived at midnight of social interaction and so forth, because the world is kind of shutting down. they'll even talk to you as a parent. They're like desperate. But sometimes you go in without an agenda and just sit on the floor next to them. If it's a boy, bring a hacky sack or a ball, lie on the bed and just throw the ball up in the air kind of a thing, and play high-low. Tell me something good that happened today. Tell me something that sucked that happened today. And see if they can start to talk. And when you hear that they're just feeling awful, the gold is they're sharing that with you. Try not to panic. Don't shut them up. Don't rush them off to the ER. But if they're talking about they feel horrible and despondent, that's therapeutic. They're puking up the bad feelings. Congratulations, well done. If you're getting nowhere, then offer them a counselor. And a lot of counselors, psychologists are doing telehealth online. Not as good as in person. Most of us are still doing in person, but we do all the safety things because, again, teenagers just do a lot better in person. But say, humor me. Why don't you talk to this shrink a couple of times and see if it's helpful. And then if you don't like it, we'll stop going. So let them know that there's resources out there. Don't push them, don't corner them, but just say, I'm here. If you change your mind, you want to chat, any time of day or night.
Okay.
Should I wrap? I better wrap.
Okay.
Okay.
I think so.
All right.
I want to thank you so much.
Can I just finish a
sure.
closing thing?
Sure.
Okay. Couple of final points. One that we touched on a bit, but guys, before you interact with your kid, be sure you've calmed yourself. Another C we don't have up there. But this too shall pass. We are going to survive this thing. So you tell them calmly about your fears, but be sure that you're not feeling like this and your voice is quavering or you're crying. Calmness is contagious, and so is panic. So kids will look to you to see how you're handling this without saying a word. So just be very careful about what you're modeling to them. Reality-based, this is scary, saying, but there are things we can do to fight back. Guys, focus on their hearts through this, and everybody's worried about test scores. I'm sorry, they'll make up that ground. But it's the EQ, it's all about the emotional stuff that we really have to focus on. If you focus on the hearts, their values, their character, that stuff, achievement follows. My son is a perfect example. Get out of their way. When the heart's in good shape, you can't stop them from achieving. But if you push the achievement first over the heart, that's a miserable prescription for life. It just doesn't work. So focus on the heart stuff first. Remember what your mission is, guys? Your mission is not to raise an Ivy League freshman. That ain't the mission. Your mission is to raise the parent of your grandchildren. The parent of your grandchildren. They will do what you do, not what you say. So what do you want to pass down? This is your heirloom. You want to pass down judgment, criticism, pressure, coldness, rejection. What do you want them to see them doing with their child, who is your grandchild, when that grandchild is 13, making your child crazy? Would you like to see things like patience, compassion, especially in the face of provocation? That's the goal you want to see down the line. And that's the thing you want to focus on. My best tricks, my first one is the deathbed exercise. I can't get it published. They say it's a depressing topic. So I need a new title. Before I went crazy on my kids, I tried to make a habit of going out in the garage and saying, Mike, before you go insane over the messy room or the bad grade, think, when you're on your deathbed, how will you feel then about what you're about to do tonight? Got it. Thank you. I go in. Ross, give me a hug. Love you, man. Really missed you away on this trip. And by the way, do you think maybe we could clean up some of these Chinese food boxes? I'll give you a hand. So it's all about remembering what's important. And that deathbed exercise clarifies it for me about the legacy I want to leave. Finally, keep laughing. Cindy and I have a favorite cartoon. It's in the New Yorker. It's this middle-aged couple on opposing couches reading books, in the afternoon sunlight. And one says to the other, dear, now that the children are all in jail, maybe we can finally take that trip we always planned. That got us through some very dark situations with our own children. Keep laughing. It's our best defense against the madness. Thank you. Good luck out there. Keep your heads down.
Indeed. Thank you, Dr. Bradley. I want to remind folks that this was presented by the Chatham Education Association, which is the union for teachers, secretaries, maintainers, custodians. We are all here for your kids every day. And this was just an attempt to help bring us together on common ground. Behind Dr. Bradley, you see if someone you know is in crisis, please reach out for help. It's not weakness to reach out for help. It's actually a sign of strength. I'm sure many people don't know, New Jersey has a mental health care disaster helpline, and that number is 866-202-4357. They will show up in an emergency 24/7, and that's something that I think New Jersey is doing very well. So thank you, and thank you for your time, and thank you NJEA for providing the funds